land.
Very different indeed. So, Tom Cross, you're the editor of Hostiles, which, as we were saying before we got on air here, is a very different movie from La La Land, which you just did. But I guess you're just going to be going through all of the great genres of American filmmaking by the
I was
time
going to say, yeah, I was going to say, I'm very lucky that the last one I did was an old forgotten Hollywood genre, maybe not forgotten, but an old Hollywood genre. Now I get to do a different Hollywood genre. So I don't know what's next. Maybe film noir or I don't know, screwball comedy. We'll see.
We'll see indeed. As I said before, this is a Western. What are
Yes.
some of the editorial challenges of working in a Western?
Well, several. I mean, I'm a movie lover, so I've always dreamt of working, cutting a Western. And as an assistant editor, I got to work on the show Deadwood, the HBO show Deadwood, which was a dream come true. And I was an assistant editor on Scott Cooper's first movie, Crazy Heart. And so we were lucky enough, or I feel like I was lucky enough to kind of help him get the band back together, so to speak, and do this. But for Scott, who is also a lover of westerns, he would talk about John Ford, but at the same time, he didn't want to get caught up in the trappings of the Western movie. So he's a fan, but he really wanted to do more of a psychological portrait first and a Western second. And so that just meant that we had to stay very close to the characters and have everything kind of come from a psychological point of view rather than have it be as he put it. He always put it, this is not your daddy's Western, And so it also just meant that there's a certain amount of violence in the film. And I think it was important for Scott, it was important to him that it feel like violence and it feel very visceral and gritty, and that it not feel like swashbuckling action. And so the way that I would kind of do that editorially is really goes back to the psychological thing, is focus on the faces and focus on seeing these events through these characters' eyes and make it very subjective. And so in that way, it was less about seeing the action covered from a lot of different points of views and in a lot of different pieces. It was more about, for example, in the beginning of the film, staying with faces and staying with the characters that we wanted to lead with. Stay on Rosamund Pike's face, and her performance is amazing. So we can do that. She's such a talented actress. You can stay in her face to register the horror of what's happening. And so in terms of a cutting strategy, that's really what he wanted to do, and that's what he wanted me to implement.
There's also a deliberate pace to the movie, which is a quality that it shares with old-fashioned Westerns. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the pace really is dictated by Scott wanting it to feel like a meditation. Again, going back to the psychological thing, he really wanted it to feel like a meditation on violence and a meditation on the Old West. But also, he wanted me to follow the landscapes, and so the cinematographer Massa had shot these beautiful landscapes in and around Santa Fe. And Scott's directive to me was to let those landscapes play out. He and I spoke about several movies. One of them was Apocalypse Now. And what he really liked about that film was that it really presented the journey in a psychological way. And it was helped by the landscapes. And so you can see a lot of dissolves in the film. You can see some, places where we've superimposed, very wide shots where we just see silhouettes of men on horses, and then set against, different types of backdrops and things like that. I mean, I think, part of it was that Scott really wanted to feel like we were in these places, and he didn't want it to feel like we were just skipping stones across locations on a map. He really wanted to feel like we were inhabiting it. So that's why I think the pace was the way it was.
You spoke a bit about your approach to the action sequences, keeping it focused mostly on the face. I do want to ask you, though, because there are some really intricate sequences with people on horseback and shooting at each other.
Sure.
Can you talk about how you put things like that together?
Sure. Um, I mean, you know, the most important thing, and I find this with any sequence that has any sort of action in it, whether it be, you know, the end of Whiplash with a drum solo, or you know, or a scene where the Comanche are attacking Captain Blocker and his party. I think the most important thing are the characters, and so. You know, Scott really wanted me to be very careful about thinking about what the scene was about. And in the case of one of the first action scenes, for lack of a better way of putting it, where the Comanche attack and where the French character played by Timothée Chalamet is killed. Sorry about the spoilers, but you know, Scott really wanted to remember that that scene is about them being attacked, but also about how the Cheyenne, led by Yellowhawk, how they actually are right by Captain Blocker's side helping. You know, that's an important plot point, and it's also important emotionally. And so that's the thing, is when you're cutting action like this, you know, there's often a lot of film. There are a lot of beautiful angles. There's a lot of stunts, and you know, a lot of great, you know, horse wrangling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is all great, but where I start is from a character's point of view, you know, and a plot point of view. What are we trying to get across in this scene, and what are these characters feeling? You know, so it's important to clock Captain Blocker noticing that Yellowhawk is helping, even though they're still in chains, even though he still doesn't trust them. So it's important to kind of plant those looks, and we can see him noticing certain things, and we see Yellowhawk and Blocker share looks. And then the action is kind of, you kind of place around it in a way. So I know that's a very general way of talking about it, but just to say that I think that's the most important thing, is to figure out what plot point do we want to get across, and you know, what emotionally, what do we want to get across from the characters. But I mean, I think another challenge I should point out, which is something I was not aware of before working on Hostiles, is that, you know, today with the ASPCA and the way we try to treat animals kindly and humanely, you know, it's not like movies of yesteryear where you could shoot and fire full load blanks and have full squibs. You know, there are certain rules where you're not allowed to have loud sounds of a certain decibel by horses. And so, you know, this movie was no different in that you know, everyone wanted to treat the horses very well. And so that just meant that a lot of bullet hits and a lot of muzzle flashes and things like that we had to add afterward, which poses interesting challenges. And of course, it also is just testimony to the actors, how, you know, they can basically give these great performances, even though it may just be a cap pistol going off, you know.
Yeah, it's something you mentioned that I was just reading the other day about how on Charge of the Light Brigade they had killed something like 20 odd horses on that movie, and I mean that. Yeah,
yeah. I think of The Wild Bunch as a great scene where Robert Ryan and some men are on a bridge, and the bridge gets dynamited, and they fall into the river below with full horses, and I don't know if any horses were hurt, but certainly you wouldn't be able to do something like that today.
What was the toughest scene that you had to shoot? I mean, to edit, excuse me.
Right. You know, probably in some ways, there are many tough scenes. You know, two things come to mind. The opening scene where Rosamund Pike's daughters are killed. You know, Scott Cooper and I, we both have little kids. And in fact, the daughters in the film are Scott Cooper's daughters playing those roles. And I think that one was very difficult for us to work on, because it was so real. The performances given to us by the daughters and by Rosamund Pike were so emotional, and just felt so real that it was it was hard to watch over and over again. And that's what you have to do in the editing room. You have to watch and then refine and watch and refine, and you're continually revising and continually watching it over and over again, especially when you're dealing with visual effects like, you know, embellishing the cabin fire or adding bullet hits. And I think so in that way, that one was probably one of the hardest to work on, just because it's, you know, just, it's hard to watch. Even, you know, my crew was all emotionally invested in the film, invested in the characters. From the very beginning to the very end, it still affected us. So we couldn't help but be affected by that. And then the other scene that comes to mind would be the scene where, and this is sort of getting into spoiler territory again, but the scene where Captain Blocker finds his best friend, Tommy, played by Rory Cochrane. He finds him sitting up against a tree, and it's clear that he's taken his own life. That was really hard to work on because it was very emotional to see Christian Bale take us to these places with his face. You know, you can really feel the sorrow and the grief. And we were all affected by it. And one of my assistant editors, who was in charge of organizing all the dailies, you know, told me later that, oh, you know, wait till you see the scene. You know, I was crying when I was watching the dailies. You know, and so a lot of the film was kind of like that. But those are the two scenes that popped into my head. Difficult for emotional reasons, I guess.
The climax of the movie, I'm trying to think of a way to talk about this without spoiling it, but
I've spoiled everything so far.
well, there's so much great tension in the ending of the movie, to try to not give too much of it away.
Sure.
Can you talk about creating that tension within that climactic scene?
Sure. Well, so that scene is really where you know, it's almost like two threads coming together. You know, when those men approach, if this is the scene you're talking about, I think this is the scene you're talking about.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
When the men approach Captain Blocker and his party, in a way, those men are who Captain Blocker was at the beginning of the film. You know, they're ignorant, they're immovable, they're almost like stone monuments. You know, you're not going to change their minds. And Blocker has been through this journey. He is a completely different person. And so this, we knew, was always going to be the scene that was in essence kind of Clash of the Titans, you know, where literally good meets evil. And so in that way, we knew it was going to be a big deal, and it was going to require a lot. And so Scott shot quite a bit of material for that. He shot a lot of great pieces, a lot of different angles and sizes and stuff. And but again, you know, it comes back to the characters. And something Scott is so brilliant at doing is working with the actors to get these amazing performances that seem very authentic. I mean, they sometimes when I would watch dailies with Christian Bale, it almost felt like I was watching a documentary. So in order to create that tension, a lot of it had to do with Max Richter's amazing score. He's an amazing composer, but also really checking in with each character and checking in with their looks. You know, and what they did so well was to Corey Anka-Kilcher and Rosamund Pike and Christian and everyone was to register, I guess, the fear when these men were approaching. And so a big part of that is to really clock what's going on emotionally, see it in the reactions. You know, that's where you're going to get a lot of suspenseful value, but also kind of hold back in terms of pace. So that's your time to really set the stage in a very deliberate, measured, slow way, because you know that as soon as someone fires the first shot, all hell's going to break loose. And that's your place where it's going to be propulsive, where it's going to just be bits and pieces. And so you don't want to overcut leading up to that moment of violence, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does. Talk a bit more about working with Scott Cooper. What's that collaboration like?
Scott Cooper is a dream to work with. As I mentioned before, you know, Scott and I met on Crazy Heart. That was his first film. I was an assistant editor, and I worked with a great editor named John Axelrad, who at the time who gave would give me scenes to cut and would encourage Scott to work with me. So I got to know Scott very well, and we always kept in touch. And then at some point, we got lucky that our schedules coincided that we could actually work together. And I went out to Santa Fe where they were filming, and then we finished posting in New York. And Scott was we worked very closely together. He was there the whole time, and he's someone who is really great at, as I mentioned, performance, but he's also great at being objective. He would love to come in and we'd look at stuff and he'd give me notes, and we'd really narrow in on very detailed things like, what is this translation of the Cheyenne? What is, what are they saying here? And is this actually accurate? We want to make sure this is as accurate as possible, but also make sure that the turn of word is appropriate to the story and appropriate to the movie. So right from the very beginning to the end, he was kind of a perfectionist in that way. Perfectionist about language, but also perfectionist about performance. A lot of the notes we got were about, let's try to let's look at a different take and try to see if this is actually getting our point across a little bit more. There's no other way to put it except for that he's a perfectionist, but it's a pleasure to work with him.
You've won an Oscar for your work on Whiplash, and you were just nominated earlier this year for La La Land. What does that kind of recognition mean for you?
Well, as a film lover, that's a dream come true. I mean, as a student of film, I always dreamt that someday maybe something like that would happen. I thought it'd be a great way to cap off, a career or something like that. I think the thing that is so wonderful about that is, number one, being a film lover, knowing that the work you're doing is part of a great tradition. That is something that I find very moving. It's very important to me, but also it really lets you be introduced to great filmmakers and great projects. So if there's the biggest thing that probably comes from that recognition by your peers, is that you get considered for really some of the best projects. And so, even though I know Scott and we're friends and I did work on Crazy Heart, I don't know that I would have been able to work on this movie if it hadn't been for the recognition I got for previous movies. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that you're kind of, you can be put in the mix for really some of the best and most interesting projects.
And of course, both of those movies were directed by Damien Chazelle, who you're reuniting with again on the Neil Armstrong biopic, First Man.
Right.
Another different movie from these last two. Have you started work on that? Can you tell us anything about it?
Sure. Yes, I did start work on that. I'm with my great crew who I worked with on the past several movies, and we've been probably filming about a month, or I should say Damien's been filming about a month or so. And I'm just doing what I do at this stage, which is I try to keep up with camera. It's very easy to fall behind, but you try to cut alongside while they're shooting. And so that way I can communicate with the director and figure out, the director can ask me, can you look at this? I'm wondering about this, or I'm wondering about that. We can have a dialogue about it. And it's all about making sure that the director feels like he's protected. So I'm in the middle of that right now. I'm getting amazing footage of Ryan Gosling as Neil Armstrong and Claire Foy as Janet Armstrong, and it's an abundance of riches. So I've been very lucky that this movie and certainly working with Scott, very lucky to work on great projects.
Well, thank you so much, Tom Cross. It's a pleasure talking with you as always. I appreciate
Thank you, Zach.
You're
I
welcome.
appreciate it. All right, be well. Thank you.